was 19 years old. Newly married, happy, and for months before she died, she begged the people around her to listen. They didn't. That single fact that the people who loved her most looked her in the eye and told her she was imagining things is what makes this story impossible to forget. Because she wasn't imagining anything. There was someone out there, watching her, learning her schedule, counting the nights she came home alone. And on a cold Friday night in December 1975, that someone finally stopped watching and started moving. This is the story of Lindy Sue Biechler. And it took 48 years, 2 generations, a science that didn't exist when she died, and a discarded paper cup in an airport trash can to finally get her justice. Lindy Sue Little was born on January 31, 1956 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Her parents separated when she was young. She grew up with her mother. Her father later had a son named Mike, about a decade younger than Lindy, and despite the age gap, those two were close. Mike would later describe his sister in 3 words: loyal, free spirit, hard worker. Her husband Philip saw something else in her too. Philip met Lindy through her stepsister, whose husband worked with him. He had gone over one afternoon to help paint their apartment. Lindy was there. He later said, and this line never gets easier to read, "I was pleased and surprised that a pretty girl like Lindy found me interesting and wanted to get to know me. That is not a man recalling a relationship. That is a man who still cannot believe his luck, even decades later." They married in October 1974. Lindy was 18. Philip worked at a Hertz car rental store while taking classes at Millersville State College. Lindy worked part-time at a flower shop. But that was just the beginning. She wanted to open her own shop one day. She pushed Philip to finish college and become an art teacher. She wanted children. She had a whole future drawn out in her mind, and Philip was standing at the center of it. In 1974, they moved into their first home together. Unit 14A at Spring Manor Apartments, a small 4-unit building on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. First floor, fresh start. But almost immediately after moving in, something changed in Lindy. She started feeling like she was being watched, not a vague, uneasy feeling. Not the kind of nervousness that comes with moving somewhere new. This was specific, persistent. She felt it in the hallways of the complex. She felt it in the parking lot when she walked to her car. She felt it in the stillness of the apartment on the evenings when Philip was still at work and the outside had gone dark. She told her friends. She told her family. She said something was wrong, that someone in or around that building was watching her, that it had been happening for weeks. And everyone told her the same thing. You just moved. You're stressed. You're overthinking it. They attributed it to the adjustment of being newly married, settling into a new space, the pressure of building a life from scratch. They were wrong. Then one night, it stopped being a feeling. Lindy was home alone. Philip was on his evening shift. The apartment was quiet. Then she looked up toward the front door. Through the small glass pane, 2 eyes were staring back at her, unblinking, still, just watching. The moment her eyes locked with his, he was gone. No footsteps, no sound. Just a smudge on the glass and the silence of an empty hallway. The man had been close enough to touch her door, close enough to see the layout of her apartment, close enough to see she was alone. After that night, she refused to be home alone after dark, but Philip's schedule hadn't changed. The evenings were still his longest shifts. Winter was coming, the days were getting shorter, and on most nights, Lindy still came home to an empty apartment, locking the door behind her, sitting in the silence, waiting. There was another night, this one at her brother Mike's house. Lindy and Philip were visiting, spending time downstairs with Mike and another sibling. Everyone was relaxed. And then from the second floor, a crash. A mirror had fallen from the wall and shattered on the floor above them. In any other home, on any other night, that is a 5-second story. A mirror falls, you check on it, you move on. But Lindy's entire body went rigid. She grabbed Philip and told him to check every room, every closet, every corner of that house before anyone moved. Her brother Mike watched her in that moment and saw something he hadn't expected. This wasn't nerves. This wasn't a woman being dramatic. Her mind had reached a place where even the sound of glass breaking in an empty room meant someone was already inside. That is what months of living in genuine fear does to a person. It rewires the way you process everything around you. Your brain stops asking, what if, and starts answering, he's here. And still, nobody connected the dots out loud. Nobody said, maybe she's right. Nobody sat down and asked the one question that might have changed everything. Who exactly is watching her, and why? Instead, they called it stress. They called it anxiety. They called it the kind of thing young women sometimes feel when life changes too fast. They were wrong. On December 5, 1975, Lindy finished her shift at the flower shop while it was still light outside. She had a few errands to run before heading home. Nothing unusual, nothing that felt like a last day. She was heading home, alone, and somewhere between where she was and where she was going, the shadow that had been following her for months was already ahead of her, already inside. It was a Friday, and Lindy's day looked like any other. She picked up Philip's paycheck from the Hertz location, stopped at the bank, then grocery shopping in Millersville, 46 cash, more bags than she could carry in one trip. She pulled into the Spring Manor parking lot at around 7:15 p.m. Dark already. Cold. She grabbed the first load, walked to Unit 104A, set the groceries on the kitchen table, turned around, and walked back to the car for the second load. That walk lasted maybe 90 seconds, long enough to leave the door unlocked. Long enough for someone waiting for exactly this moment to slip inside. Across town, Lindy's Aunt Celeste and Uncle Merle were heading to a basketball game their kid was playing, but they made a quick decision. They'd stop by Lindy's place first. She shouldn't be home alone on a Friday night. They pulled up at 8:46 p.m. Merle stayed in the car. Celeste walked to Unit 104A. The front door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The first thing she saw was the lamp on the floor, knocked over, the kind of thing that doesn't fall on its own. Celeste stepped inside and called out for Lindy. No answer. The apartment was quiet in a way that didn't feel like quiet. It felt like something had already happened and the air was still holding it. Then she saw the signs of a struggle. It was everywhere, from the front door to the entryway, making it clear that something terrible had occurred inside. She took one more step toward the kitchen, and she found her. Lindy was found on the kitchen floor. The scene was devastating, showing clear signs of a targeted and deliberate attack that left investigators in shock. The groceries from Lindy's first trip were still on the table above her. Milk, vegetables, the ordinary things she had bought an hour earlier, sitting right there while she lay on the floor beneath them. Innocence and violence, separated by 18 inches of kitchen table. Celeste ran. When police arrived and walked through that door, the lead officer would later say he had spent years on the force and seen things most people never see. What was inside Unit 104A that night was different. This was not a crime of opportunity that got out of hand. This was concentrated, deliberate. The work of someone who had come through that door with a purpose. The medical examiner's report confirmed the sheer brutality of the attack. Lindy had suffered numerous injuries across her body, showing that the assailant had followed her even as she tried to escape. 2 different knives were used. The butcher knife from her own kitchen, handle wrapped in a towel to avoid prints, and a second knife, a smaller 4-inch blade that the killer had brought with him. That knife was never found. It left with him. Lindy had fought. Defensive marks on her hands confirmed the struggle. She hadn't surrendered. She fought back with everything she had. A retired FBI consultant who later reviewed the case said the killer likely delivered a crippling blow early. What came after was something else entirely. Why that much rage toward a girl everyone described as warm and gentle? This wasn't just a murder. This was an execution. Someone who didn't just want her dead, they wanted her destroyed. That level of anger almost always means something personal. No signs of forced entry on any window or door. Whoever walked into that apartment either had a key or walked through a door Lindy had left unlocked for 90 seconds. Outside, a car had been spotted near the building. Dark-colored, standard size, American-made. Headlights on, engine running like something waiting for a signal. By the time police went looking, the space was empty. No plate, no witness who looked closely enough. Philip was at work when the call came. He arrived at the complex and detectives stopped him from going inside. He was 22 years old and had been married barely a year. He stood in the same parking lot where Lindy had pulled in just hours earlier, groceries in her arms, heading inside for what she didn't know was the last time. Now he stood there trying to understand what he was being told. When Lindy's father heard the news, the grief that hit him was so sudden and so violent that police physically had to restrain him, a father, held back by strangers in a parking lot. While somewhere inside that building his daughter was still on the kitchen floor, there are no words for that image. There is only the weight of it. On the day Lindy was buried, a reporter asked Police Chief Donald Sheeler where the investigation stood. He said, "We actually don't have a thing at this time." He was being honest. Because despite everything collected from that apartment, they were standing at the start of a road that would take nearly 5 decades to reach its end. In among that evidence was something microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, pressed into the fabric of Lindy's clothing. A biological signature the killer had left behind without knowing it, something so small it fit inside an evidence bag and got shelved in a storage room. In 1975, there was no way to read it, so it waited. In the weeks that followed, police interviewed over 300 people, chased leads, cleared suspects one by one. And then, less than a year after Lindy was buried, her killer did something almost no one in the history of violent crime ever does. He came back. Every case here takes nearly 15 days of research, digging through records, verifying facts, and rebuilding real lives that deserve to be remembered. If this work means something to you, like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us which part of today's case hit you hardest. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description below. Now, back to the case. Every thread went cold. Philip was cleared within days. A local man named Mark Capilupo, 18 years old, convicted of violent attacks on women in Lancaster, was on investigators' radar, but he was shot and killed by a prison guard in July 1976 during a prison escape. Whatever he knew or didn't know died with him. 4 months after Lindy's murder, a 43-year-old woman named Mary Shinzing was stabbed to death in Columbia, just 15 miles away. Same style of attack, same level of violence. Detectives laid both files side by side. But when a man named Kenneth Dale Arndt was convicted for Mary's murder and denied any connection to Lindy, investigators looked hard and found none. Another door closed. By the end of 1976, the case had no suspects, no leads, no direction. Then the killer reminded everyone he hadn't gone anywhere. December 26, 1976. 1 year and 3 weeks after Lindy's murder, her family drove to Boehm's United Methodist Church in Pakia Township to visit her grave. Lindy's headstone had been drenched in red paint, not splashed carelessly, soaked. And beneath the paint, deep scratches had been gouged into the stone, the kind you only make if you press hard and stay long enough to mean every single one. Every other grave in that cemetery was untouched, just hers. The red paint was the color of what he had done to her. The scratches were the count of it. He had stood at her grave in the dark and recreated it. He was not done with Lindy Sue Biechler. Even in death, he would not leave her alone. 9 days later, on January 5, 1977, an envelope arrived at the Manor Township Police Department. Written on the outside in capital letters, URGT. Chief Donald Sheeler opened it and found 2 handwritten pages, different handwriting on each. He read the first page. Then he read it again. "Hi Sheila, just eats up your heart knowing you haven't caught me yet. Still around. Lindy's marker on her grave just turned me on like she did, and the way she looked all bloody, like the paint on her marker. The scratch and nick marks represent the knife stabs. Count them. I'll tell you what, Chief Pig, you print this letter in the paper along with a picture in Friday night's Lancaster paper and Saturday morning's paper, and I might confess, got busted once for drugs a few years back. Live in the west end of Lancaster suburbs, 5 feet 10. Fat and beautiful, and capable of killing again without knowing it. December 5, 1975, I was under the stupor of amphetamines. Like right now, well-educated man in the community, single, good job, but God? Please, Chief, help me. I am losing my mind. Help me before I kill again. The headaches kill me every time. Will God forgive me? God, I need a priest. What have I done? Help me, please." The second page was signed by someone calling herself Janice Crum. She claimed to be the killer's friend. She wrote that he had confessed everything to her, that he was mentally ill, that if the letter was published he would turn himself in. He said she wrote it while he was asleep. Police found a real woman named Janice Crum in Lancaster County. She had no connection to the case. The FBI brought in a profiler named James Fitzgerald, an expert in forensic stylistics, the science of analyzing writing patterns. His conclusion reshaped everything. Both pages, he said, were written by the same person. The capitalization patterns, the underlining, specific spelling choices, they matched in ways a forger would not think to replicate. And then he said something that cracked the mystery open in a new direction. The writer was possibly a woman or someone deeply conflicted about their identity. His reasoning, the second page, is written from the perspective of a calm observer, which is how women tend to structure their writing. And in 1975, very few men would describe themselves as fat and beautiful. But police already knew Lindy's killer was male. The bloody shoe print confirmed that. So if Fitzgerald was right, the letter wasn't from the killer alone. It was from someone close to him, someone who knew what happened. Someone who was present or protecting him, or both. A second person. That possibility was never resolved. It remains open today. Then came the worst failure of all. The original letter, the only physical object connecting directly to the killer's mind, was lost by the evidence lab. Not destroyed, not stolen, lost. No fingerprints had been lifted from it, no handwriting preserved for future comparison. The only piece of the killer's psychology investigators had ever held in their hands, gone. The case had been handed one extraordinary window into the person responsible. The system lost it. After that, the years became a cycle. 1982, Florida serial killer Gerald Eugene Staino, 37, confessed murders. Father lived nearby, circulated his photo. Nobody recognized him. Ruled out. 1984, the DA paid $2,000 for 2 psychics. Olive-skinned, dark hair, tattoo on one arm. Vague enough to match thousands of men. Led nowhere. 1989, attempted DNA extraction from a dried blood sample. 2 deteriorated. Useless. 1992, a new detective team took over. Still nothing moved. In June 2006, a volunteer group called the VI.Q Society, 50 forensic experts, profilers, and former law enforcement agents from across the country, gathered specifically to hear the Biechler case. Detectives Joe Giese and Pete Savage laid out everything, the evidence, the timeline, every failure across 30 years. And for the first time in that closed room, they revealed what they believed the motive had been. That motive was never made public. It went into that room with those 50 people and never came back out. Whatever drove David Sinopoli to walk into that apartment on December 5, 1975, investigators believed they had the answer, and they said nothing publicly. For decades. Meanwhile, Lindy's parents were running out of time. Her father, Wayne, died in the summer of 2000. Her mother, Eleanor, followed in early 2007. For 30 years, they had lived in the same county as the man who killed their daughter, passing strangers on the street, looking at faces, sitting in church pews, never knowing which set of eyes had been the last ones Lindy ever saw. They spent 30 years looking. They died in the dark. But one person refused to accept that this was how Lindy's story ended. Mike Little had spent his entire adult life watching this case go nowhere. He was a U.S. Navy officer, disciplined, methodical, the kind of person who does not accept "we tried" as a final answer. Lindy was his older half-sister, and for 30 years, the system had failed her completely. In December 2007, Mike arranged for a billboard on Route 30 near Route 283, one of the busiest stretches of highway in Lancaster County. On it, 2 photographs, 2 young women, and a question in large letters above their faces. "Do you know who murdered us?" The second face belonged to Christy Myrick, a 25-year-old schoolteacher from Lancaster, raped and murdered in her home in December 1992. Her brother Vince had connected with Mike through shared grief. 2 brothers. 2 unsolved cases. One last attempt to make the city remember. The billboard was supposed to stay up for 30 days. The advertising agency kept it for 10 extra days at no charge. Local news covered both cases again. No new leads came in. But Mike did not take it as defeat. He was a U.S. Navy officer. He had spent his career operating in environments where impossible was just a word people used before they found another way. He filed the billboard as one more step taken, one more thing tried. The word "yet" was doing a lot of heavy lifting in his life, but it was still doing it. Meanwhile, something important had already happened quietly, without headlines. Back in 1997, forensic scientists had managed to extract a male DNA profile from the biological evidence found on Lindy's clothing. After 22 years, science had finally caught up enough to read what the killer had left behind. In 2000, that profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. The system searched and returned nothing. Whoever had killed Lindy had never been convicted of a crime that required a DNA sample. The profile sat there, unmatched, for the next 18 years. Then in June 2018, Lancaster County got an answer in a different case, and it changed everything. Raymond Rowe, a 49-year-old DJ who performed under the name DJ Freeze, was arrested for the rape and murder of Christy Myrick. The tool that caught him was genetic genealogy, a method that doesn't require the killer to already be in a criminal database. It works by finding distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded DNA to genealogy websites, then building family trees outward until a likely match is identified. DNA had just reached into the past and pulled out a killer who thought he'd been invisible for 26 years. Philip Biechler saw the news. He had remarried, was living quietly in Millersville, and had carried the weight of December 5, 1975 for over 4 decades. He read about Christy Marak's case being solved and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. If Christy could get justice after 26 years, why not Lindy after 43? He made calls, he pushed. And in 2018, Lancaster County District Attorney Craig Stedman commissioned Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based genetic research firm, to take a fresh look at the DNA evidence from the Biechler case. Parabon started with DNA phenotyping. Human DNA doesn't just identify who you are. It contains information about what you look like, skin tone, eye color, hair color, facial structure. By studying the genetic markers in the killer's sample, scientists could build a visual estimate of the man who had stood in Lindy's apartment in 1975. On September 5, 2019, 44 years after the murder, investigators released two composite images to the public. One showed what the killer likely looked like at age 25, around the time of the murder. The second showed an age-progressed version, what he might look like today, around 65 years old. For 44 years, he had been faceless. Now, for the first time, he had eyes, a jawline, a face. The images were distributed across media. Tips came in. Everyone led to a dead end. But Parabon was not finished. In December 2020, the DA's office asked Parabon to go further, full genetic genealogy analysis. This is where the real detective work began. Genetic genealogy works by uploading a DNA profile to public databases where ordinary people share genetic information to find relatives and trace their ancestry. The killer wasn't in any of these databases, but his distant cousins might be, his third cousins, his fourth cousins, people who had no idea they shared bloodlines with a murderer. Parabon's researchers began building family trees branch by branch, eliminating candidates. The DNA told them something early. The killer's ancestry traced to a small village called Gasparina in the Calabria region of southern Italy. That narrowed the field to approximately 2,300 people in Lancaster County with that specific Italian heritage who would have been adults in 1975. Then they started eliminating wrong age, wrong gender, wrong location. The circle got smaller. In December 2021, after more than a year of genealogical research, Parabon gave detectives a name, David Sinopoli. Police pulled his records. No criminal history, never once connected to the Biechler investigation across 46 years of inquiry. But there was one detail that made every detective in that room go very still. In 1974 and 1975, David Sinopoli had lived at Spring Manor Apartments, the same 4-unit building, the same address as Lindy and Philip. He had moved out just months before the murder. They had his name. They had 46 years of evidence pointing at him, but they needed fresh DNA, current, undeniable, the kind that would hold up in court. The problem was, they couldn't just ask him for it. They needed him to give it to them without knowing he was giving it at all. And in February 2022, David Sinopoli walked into Philadelphia International Airport and handed them exactly what they needed. February 11, 2022, Philadelphia International Airport. Morning crowds, thousands of people moving, checking phones, buying coffee, except for the detectives who were not moving at all. They had been watching David Sinopoli for weeks. They knew his face, his routine, his address. They had a DNA profile from 1975 waiting for something fresh to compare against. They couldn't approach him, couldn't tip him off, so they waited. Sinopoli was at the airport with his wife and another couple, heading out on a trip. He ordered a coffee, he drank it. And when he was done, he dropped the cup into a trash can and walked toward his gate. The moment he was out of sight, a detective walked to that trash can, reached in, and picked up a paper cup that a 68-year-old man had thrown away without a second thought. That cup went into an evidence bag. That bag went to DNA Labs International. And what came back was not a clue, not a lead. It was a confirmation 46 years in the making. The sample was then forwarded to Cybergenetics, a Pittsburgh laboratory specializing in separating mixed DNA profiles. Their analysis returned a single number, 1 in 10 trillion. The entire population of Earth is 8 billion people. 1 in 10 trillion means the odds of that DNA belonging to anyone other than David Sinopoli were not just small. They were beyond calculation. Every person alive could be tested and you still would not find another match. It was him, the semen found on Lindy's underwear in 1975. The blood drops on her pantyhose. All of it, the same man. On the morning of July 17, 2022, Lancaster County detectives drove to a home in East Hempfield Township. David Sinopoli answered the door. He was 68 years old. Retired from a local printing house where colleagues would later describe him as a good acquaintance, quiet, unremarkable, nothing that would make you look twice. He had been married for 36 years to a woman who, according to his own attorney, had absolutely no idea what her husband had done in December 1975. He had 3 children and 9 grandchildren. 9 grandchildren who called him grandfather, who sat at his table for holidays, who had no idea that the man pouring them juice had spent 46 years carrying the weight of what he had done to a 19-year-old woman in an apartment he used to walk past. To everyone in his life, David Sinopoli was an ordinary man living out a quiet retirement. And every single morning for 46 years, he had woken up less than 5 miles from the apartment where he had committed this crime. He had never left Lancaster. He had stayed, built a family, grown old, all of it within driving distance of Closs Drive. Every morning, for 46 years. He was arrested without incident. The exact time span between the murder and the arrest was later calculated: 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days. He pleaded not guilty in October 2022. Then, on October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli walked into a Lancaster County courtroom and changed his plea. The room was full. Lindy's family on one side, Sinopoli's family on the other. A large photograph of Lindy Sue Biechler, 19 years old, was placed on an easel next to the defendant's table. Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson stood and pointed at the photograph. These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten. While the defendant was able to carry on with his life, Lindy was extinguished by him. She turned to Sinopoli. "Look at her. Look at the precious life you stole in 1975. Sinopoli glanced at the photograph. Without reaction, Philip Biechler stood and spoke. He was in his 70s now. The young man who had gone to help paint an apartment and met a girl named Lindy stood in that courtroom and tried to put 48 years into words. He said he had tried to live out Lindy's hopes for him. He finished college, became an artist, the way she had always encouraged him to be. But after the murder, he made a decision. He would not get into another relationship, not for a long time. The outcome of this decision was a very lonely existence. At times, I used alcohol and drugs to hide or cloud my grief. He eventually remarried. He built a life. But he never stopped carrying December 5, 1975. Then he looked directly at Sinopoli. You took a huge part of my life from me and caused an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering for so many people. While others had to live with the terrible consequences of what you did, you got to live your life. While I forgive you because my God tells me to, you need to pay for your actions." Judge David Ashworth then addressed Sinopoli. "You chose to viciously stab Lindy Sue Biechler 19 times and then defile her to satisfy your own selfish sexual desires. The enormity of the damage you have caused is incomprehensible. The depravity of your actions cannot be overstated." Then the judge said something that cut through every legal formality in that room. "Make no mistake, you are not standing here because you developed a pang of conscience. You did not come forward to give this family closure. I have seen nothing in your conduct or your words to suggest that you are truly remorseful for what you have done." David Sinopoli was sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. Given his age, effectively a life sentence. When given his chance to speak, he said 9 words. "I would like to apologize to everyone, including my wife." No explanation, no motive, no answer to the question Philip had asked directly, why. That question has never been answered. The motive detectives identified decades ago and sealed inside a case file. It stayed sealed. Some things, it seems, the system keeps even after it delivers justice. She was 19 years old, newly married, full of plans for a flower shop, a family, a future she never got to live. For months before she died, she told everyone around her that something was wrong, that someone was watching her, that she was afraid. She said it to her husband, to her friends, to her family. She said it clearly more than once, and everyone told her she was imagining it. She wasn't. The man who watched her had lived 30 feet away. He learned her schedule from the inside. He knew which nights Philip worked late. He knew when the parking lot was quiet. He moved out of that building in the months before the murder, but he never moved far. He stayed in the same county for 46 years, raised a family, grew old, watched time pass, and said nothing to anyone. It took a science that didn't exist when she died. It took a genetic map traced to a village in southern Italy. It took a detective standing at an airport trash can, reaching into the ordinary mess of a Tuesday morning, pulling out a paper cup. It took all of that to prove what Lindy already knew. She told everyone she was being watched. She was right. And 48 years later, the world finally believed her. What do you think? Did Sinopoli's wife of 36 years truly have no idea who she was living with? Or is that something a person simply cannot hide for that long? The original letter, the only piece of evidence that connected directly to the killer's mind, was lost by the evidence lab. You think that single failure changed the outcome of this case? Genetic genealogy has now solved cases that were considered permanently cold. Does that technology give you hope, or does it raise concerns about privacy that we haven't fully answered yet?